It began on an unusually quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the sun sits low and gentle, promising a peaceful weekend. The street, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and pastel-colored homes, looked like it had been pulled straight out of a real estate brochure. But beneath that suburban calm simmered tensions that no one could see. Yet, the narrator of the story, a homeowner who had lived peacefully in this neighborhood for years, had always taken pride in maintaining the property. The fence around the yard, solid cedar planks stained a deep, rich brown, stood at the regulation 6 feet. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't offensive. It was practical, keeping the yard private, secure, and tidy. But one neighbor didn't see it that way. Karen lived 2 houses down, but her presence stretched further than her driveway. She was the self-appointed sheriff of the street, the type who could spot an improperly stacked trash can from 50 yards away. She thrived on reporting any perceived violation, whether real or imagined. And when she set her sights on the fence, it was as if she'd found her new personal crusade. The first sign of trouble came as a certified letter taped to the gate. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't even an official HOA notice. It was from Karen, citing a page and paragraph from the neighborhood guidelines, claiming the fence blocked the aesthetic harmony of the street and was too tall for the character of the community. She demanded it be lowered to 5 feet or else. The narrator laughed it off at first. The fence was well within code, and the HOA had approved it years ago. But Karen didn't stop there. Soon, whispers began floating around. Other neighbors were approached on their morning walks, warned about that fence ruining property values. Someone even spotted Karen taking photos with a tape measure in hand, crouched like a detective gathering evidence. Days turned into weeks, and the complaints escalated. Karen called the city zoning office, though they found no issue. She emailed the HOA repeatedly, copying everyone on the block, demanding urgent action. But when nothing happened fast enough for her liking, she started showing up uninvited, banging on doors, insisting that the fence was an eyesore, a disgrace, a blot on their otherwise perfect neighborhood. This wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about power. It was about control. And the narrator, patient by nature but not one to be bullied, decided that if Karen wanted a fight over 6 feet of cedar, she'd get one. The turning point came on a windy afternoon when Karen stood in the driveway with arms crossed, glaring as though she owned not only her property but everyone else's too. That icy stare wasn't a request anymore. It was a challenge. That night, the narrator sat at the kitchen table sketching plans. If Karen thought 6 feet was too tall, what would she say about 9? If she wanted to turn this into a battle, she was about to regret ever starting it. Within days, contractors arrived. Trucks pulled up. Tools clanged. Boards piled high. Neighbors peeked out through curtains, wondering what new project was underway. Karen, of course, stormed over demanding answers, but the workers simply smiled and kept on building. By the end of the week, the fence didn't just stand 6 feet tall anymore. It towered 3 feet higher, reinforced, and even more imposing. The rich cedar would gleam freshly stained, like a monument to defiance. Word spread fast. People drove by slowly to gawk. Some neighbors smirked approvingly, secretly cheering the bold move. Others shook their heads, dreading the drama about to unfold. And at the center of it all stood Karen, her face twisted with fury, phone in hand, threatening lawsuits and city inspectors. But the narrator wasn't worried. Every nail, every board, every inch of the new fence was within legal limits. Karen could complain, but she couldn't do a thing, at least not through official channels. The quiet street now buzzed with tension. Every glance felt like surveillance. Every knock on the door carried suspicion. And somewhere deep down, the narrator knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down. If anything, the fence had just thrown gasoline on a fire that was about to blaze out of control. As the sun set behind that towering cedar wall, casting long shadows across the yard, a new kind of unease settled in. The battle lines were drawn. The neighborhood had chosen sides, and this once peaceful block was about to become a battleground. The fence wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a statement, and Karen, humiliated and enraged, was already plotting her next move. The new fence rose over the property like a fortress wall, its cedar planks shining under the afternoon sun. What had once been an ordinary yard divider was now a landmark. Impossible to ignore, impossible to mistake for an accident. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others grinning at the audacity. But one person didn't find it amusing at all. Karen's fury was immediate and volcanic. She was seen pacing her driveway, phone glued to her ear, gesturing wildly as though commanding invisible troops. By evening, an email chain began circulating around the block, filled with accusations about the monstrous wall that supposedly destroyed property values, cast unsafe shadows, and made the neighborhood look like a prison yard. She claimed the structure threatened community harmony and violated the spirit of suburban living. When her emails failed to get traction, Karen escalated. She called the city zoning office again. Inspectors arrived, clipboards in hand, only to confirm what the narrator already knew. The fence was perfectly legal. They left shaking their heads, amused at being summoned over a trivial complaint. That setback didn't slow Karen down. If rules couldn't tear the fence down, maybe she could turn the neighborhood against its owner. She went door to door, canvassing like a political candidate trying to rally support. She warned everyone about what happens if one person ignores the guidelines. Some neighbors nodded politely, not wanting to get on her bad side, but few genuinely cared. The more Karen pushed, the more people started quietly siding with the narrator. After all, it wasn't the fence causing tension, it was Karen. Yet she refused to see it. In her mind, she was saving the neighborhood from an unspeakable threat. Her tactics became more extreme. Late at night, the narrator noticed headlights sweeping across the yard, a car idling at the curb for longer than normal. The next morning, mysterious notes appeared on the mailbox. Anonymous, but written in the same sharp tone Karen used in her emails. They warned about dire consequences if the fence wasn't lowered. Still, the narrator refused to be intimidated. The taller fence wasn't just legal. It was a message. This was private property, and no one, not even Karen, had the right to dictate how it looked. But Karen wasn't done. The HOA meeting that month turned into a circus. Normally, these gatherings were sleepy affairs where someone might mention landscaping budgets or holiday decorations. This time, Karen arrived with a stack of photos, printouts of emails, and what she called evidence of a fence emergency. She demanded an emergency vote to protect the neighborhood's character. She spoke with such urgency, as though the fence were radioactive. But as she droned on, it became obvious to everyone in the room. This wasn't about the fence at all. It was about control. She couldn't stand the idea of someone defying her vision of what their perfect little street should be. The HOA board listened politely but declined to take action. They reminded Karen that they had already approved the original fence and that the new addition, though taller, still complied with city code. The matter was closed, at least officially. Karen left the meeting red-faced and trembling, her voice echoing through the hall as she vowed this wasn't over. And true to her word, it wasn't. Within a week, strange things started happening. Small items went missing from the narrator's front porch. A row of flowers along the fence was trampled overnight. Deep scratches appeared on the wood, as though someone had dragged a metal object against it. It was petty, it was childish, but it was unmistakably deliberate. The narrator kept calm, documenting everything, taking photos, making notes. If Karen wanted to play dirty, there would be proof. But even as precautions were taken, a question loomed. How far was she willing to go? The tension on the block grew thicker by the day. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Others whispered their support quietly, offering sympathetic smiles or quick nods in passing. The street, once a picture of suburban peace, now felt like a chessboard with pieces moving in secret. Karen's obsession with the fence became the talk of the entire neighborhood. Even people from outside the block started driving by just to see it. What was meant to shame the narrator had backfired spectacularly. The fence wasn't an eyesore, it was a legend in the making. But legends come with consequences. And Karen, humiliated and desperate, decided to escalate in a way no one expected. She wasn't going to stop at complaints, emails, or sneaky sabotage. She wanted to make life unbearable. One night, just as the neighborhood settled into sleep, the narrator spotted movement outside the window, a figure crouching near the fence line. The security lights snapped on, catching a glimpse of someone retreating into the darkness. It was too quick to confirm, but who else could it be? By morning, a new development made it clear. Karen had taken her campaign of harassment to the next level. The morning after that fleeting glimpse of movement near the fence, the narrator stepped outside to find something unsettling. The tall cedar boards, once smooth and gleaming, now bore fresh streaks of black spray paint. Someone had scrawled angry words across the wood in hurried, crooked lines, a bitter message meant to intimidate. The vandalism was crude, but the intent was clear. This wasn't a random act. This was personal. Photos were taken immediately. Every smear of paint, every jagged letter, every inch of damage was documented. The narrator had anticipated something like this, and now there was proof. But while the evidence spoke volumes, it didn't erase the anger boiling under the surface. The fence had gone from being a symbol of defiance to an outright target. Neighbors came by throughout the day, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering about who could have done it. They didn't have to say the name out loud. Everyone knew where the suspicion pointed. Karen, who'd been spotted late at night prowling near property lines, now looked more like an aggressor than a concerned neighbor. Yet when confronted in subtle, roundabout ways, she denied everything, acting as though the vandalism shocked her as much as anyone else. But Karen's denials rang hollow. Not long after the graffiti appeared, the harassment escalated. Anonymous complaints flooded the city's hotline about illegal construction noise, unpermitted alterations, and even environmental hazards supposedly caused by the cedar planks. Inspectors came again and again, each time leaving empty-handed, growing increasingly frustrated at being dragged into what was clearly a neighborly feud spiraling out of control. The narrator stayed calm, though the tension was becoming unbearable. The fence was cleaned and sealed again, stronger than before, its color richer and darker after the repairs. If Karen thought vandalism would force submission, she miscalculated badly. Every attack only made the narrator more determined to hold the line. Then came the night that changed everything. Around midnight, motion sensor lights flared to life, cutting through the darkness like spotlights. The narrator checked the security cameras and froze. There on the footage, barely concealed by a hood, was a figure carrying what looked like garden shears, reaching over the fence to snip at the new flower beds planted along its base. The video wasn't perfect, but the walk, the posture, the unmistakable silhouette, it had to be Karen. The next morning, the evidence was undeniable. Dozens of flowers lay severed at the stems, trampled into the soil. It was petty vandalism, but it carried a darker undertone. The Karen was willing to sneak around at night destroying plants. What else might she try? The narrator decided enough was enough. The security footage was compiled, every incident logged with timestamps and photos. The plan wasn't just to defend the fence anymore, it was to turn the tables completely. If Karen wanted to fight dirty, she would be met with overwhelming proof and public humiliation. But even as preparations began to take the battle into official channels, Karen made her boldest move yet. One morning, construction markers appeared along the shared property line. Stakes, string, and neon spray paint mapped out some mysterious project. Karen was building something. Rumors spread quickly. Was she planning to put up her own fence to block the narrators? Was she digging for some ridiculous landscaping excuse to invade their yard? The truth came out 2 days later. Deliveries arrived at Karen's driveway. Pallets of lattice, trellises, and towering hedges still in their nursery pots. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was launching a full-scale counterattack. If she couldn't tear down the fence, she'd drown it out with her own construction, creating an even taller wall of greenery and wood on her side. It was absurd. It was overkill. And it transformed the quiet suburban street into a stage for a feud everyone was watching. Neighbors started hosting evening walks just to catch glimpses of the escalating madness. Some brought lawn chairs to the edge of their driveways, sipping coffee as though they were watching a live performance. The narrator didn't back down. If Karen wanted to turn her yard into a barricade, then this would become a battle of endurance. More cameras were installed. Lighting along the fence line was upgraded to high-intensity flood beams, making nighttime sabotage nearly impossible. And quietly, a meeting was scheduled with the HOA board, not to plead for help, but to present them with irrefutable evidence of Karen's harassment. When the footage was finally shown to the HOA leadership, it left them stunned. They had tolerated Karen's complaints for years, dismissing her antics as harmless busybody behavior. But now they saw the truth. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she was terrorizing it. Still, Karen wasn't done. Her hedge wall went up in record time, stretching along her property like a green curtain. She bragged loudly in her yard about how she'd teach certain people a lesson, her voice carrying far enough for everyone to hear. But what she didn't realize was that her every move was now being recorded. Every late-night trip outside, every suspicious rustle near the fence line. The narrator had turned defense into offense. Evidence was piling up like kindling, ready to ignite at the perfect moment. As dusk settled one evening, the street looked almost unrecognizable. What was once a peaceful row of pastel homes now felt divided by fortresses, both wooden and leafy, built on bitterness and spite. The feud had reached a boiling point, and neither side seemed willing to give an inch. The narrator knew the time was coming to make a decisive move, one that would not only end Karen's harassment but make sure she could never pull a stunt like this again. By the time summer rolled around, the feud had evolved from a private spat into a full-blown neighborhood spectacle. What began as a single complaint about a 6-foot fence now looked like a suburban Cold War, with escalating measures on both sides. The narrator's property had become a fortress of order and precision. Tall cedar planks standing proud, reinforced, and spotless under high-intensity floodlights. Karen's yard, in contrast, was transforming into an overbuilt barricade of hedges, trellises, and towering lattice panels. The street no longer felt like a quiet block of pastel houses and clipped lawns. It felt divided, tense, alive with whispered commentary. On one side were neighbors who admired the narrator's calm defiance, silently rooting for someone to finally stand up to Karen. On the other side were those too intimidated to speak out, nodding politely at Karen's rants even as they avoided her gaze. And in the middle were the curious, people who had no stake in the fight but treated it like free entertainment. Evening walks turned into spectator events. Residents timed their strolls to catch a glimpse of the latest developments. A new security camera mounted on the narrator's fence, fresh rows of hedges on Karen's side, or the latest passive-aggressive decorations she installed, like oversized "Welcome to our beautiful neighborhood" banners clearly aimed as mockery. Cars from outside the neighborhood slowed as they passed. The infamous fence war, now local gossip beyond the block. The narrator, steady and strategic, didn't engage in shouting matches or petty displays. Instead, they quietly compiled evidence, footage of late-night trespassing, records of city inspections that turned up nothing, logs of every vandalism attempt. Each document, each photo was filed carefully, building an unshakable case. Karen, unaware of how much proof stacked against her, grew louder, angrier, and more reckless by the day. The tipping point came during an HOA barbecue, one of the rare community gatherings meant to foster peace. Instead, it turned into a battlefield of whispered alliances. Karen arrived early, brandishing her usual stack of papers, ready to spread her narrative about how one person's selfish fence was ruining everything. But the tide had shifted. People weren't nodding along anymore. They were rolling their eyes. Behind polite smiles, neighbors exchanged stories about Karen's constant meddling. The time she called the city over a mailbox color, the endless complaints about parked cars, the surveillance photos she'd taken of kids' bicycles left on driveways. It was becoming clear that this wasn't about a fence at all. It was about control, and everyone knew it. When the narrator arrived, conversation slowed. Everyone was waiting to see if there would be a confrontation. Karen, unable to resist, made a scene. She pointed toward the fence towering just 2 houses down, raising her voice to accuse the narrator of destroying property values and bringing down the character of the block. But this time, the crowd didn't rally behind her. Instead, a few brave neighbors openly defended the narrator, pointing out how pristine the property looked and how the fence met every regulation. Karen's voice rose higher, shriller, as she realized her grip on the neighborhood was slipping. What Karen didn't know was that the narrator had chosen this moment carefully. When the accusations reached their peak, the narrator calmly produced printed screenshots and photos showing every incident of harassment, every failed complaint, and most damning of all, the security footage of someone who looked suspiciously like Karen vandalizing the fence late at night. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the images passed from hand to hand. Karen tried to deflect, claiming it wasn't her, claiming it was all fabricated, but the damage was done. For the first time, the HOA board members, long weary of her constant complaints, spoke up. They announced that if Karen continued harassing her neighbor, they would have no choice but to issue formal violations against her instead. Humiliated but still defiant, Karen stormed out of the barbecue, muttering threats about lawyers and lawsuits. The narrator didn't celebrate outwardly, but inside there was a quiet satisfaction. This was no longer just a personal defense, it was a decisive shift in public opinion. The neighborhood, once cowed by Karen's presence, was now openly questioning her authority. But Karen wasn't finished. In the days following the barbecue, her behavior became erratic. Loud yard work at odd hours, glaring from her driveway at anyone who dared speak to the narrator. More anonymous complaints filed to the city, all dismissed just as quickly as they arrived. She was unraveling, yet still dangerous in her desperation. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived, not from Karen, not from the HOA, but from an attorney. It was a cease and desist order, accusing the narrator of defamation and targeted harassment. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. Karen was accusing her neighbor of the very behavior she herself had been committing for months. But it was also a sign. She was prepared to drag this fight into court if necessary. The narrator knew this battle wasn't over. Evidence could win the day, but courtrooms required time, money, and patience. Karen had shown she was willing to burn it all down to get her way. And as the neighborhood buzzed with rumors of lawsuits and HOA intervention, one thing became clear. This feud was reaching its climax. The cedar fence, now gleaming brighter than ever under the afternoon sun, stood as more than a property divider. It was a monument to stubbornness, resilience, and pride. But on the other side of that towering wall, Karen was planning her next move. One final strike that she believed would end the fight once and for all. The attorney's letter landed like a thunderclap. Neatly typed on expensive paper, it accused the narrator of defaming a concerned resident and causing emotional distress. It was laughable, yet it carried real weight. Even a frivolous lawsuit meant time in court, mounting legal fees, and endless stress. It was exactly the kind of chaos Karen thrived on. The narrator didn't panic. Instead, they prepared. Every document, every photo, every second of security footage was copied and stored. Multiple hard drives, cloud backups, even a physical binder, the evidence was organized with meticulous care. Karen's claims would never hold up under scrutiny. But this was no longer just about defending a fence. It was about defending a reputation, and more importantly, making sure Karen's campaign of intimidation was crushed permanently. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her theatrics. She paraded through the neighborhood with printouts of the attorney's letter, telling anyone who would listen that justice was coming. She positioned herself as the victim, spinning wild tales about how she'd been bullied for simply wanting the block to look beautiful and harmonious. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People who once nodded politely now avoided her entirely, ducking back into their houses when they saw her coming. But Karen didn't seem to notice her dwindling support. She doubled down, hiring contractors to add more improvements to her yard. Towering trellises lined with artificial vines, motion sensors that blared alarms at the faintest movement, even a tall wooden gate painted with passive-aggressive slogans about community pride. It was over the top, almost comical, but there was an edge to it too. This was no longer just a feud. It was an obsession consuming her every waking moment. The narrator kept quiet in public but worked tirelessly behind the scenes. An HOA emergency meeting was called, this time not by Karen, but by board members fed up with her behavior. The narrator arrived armed with evidence. When the board reviewed hours of surveillance footage showing Karen prowling the property line at night, vandalizing plants, and glaring into security cameras, their decision was swift. Karen was issued a formal warning. Cease the harassment or face fines and possible legal action from the HOA itself. For most people, that would have been the end. But Karen wasn't most people. The warning only seemed to fuel her anger. Late one night, neighbors reported hearing shouting from her yard, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the ground. The next morning, a large section of her elaborate trellis was mysteriously damaged. She blamed the narrator immediately, claiming sabotage. Karen filed a police report. Officers arrived, walked the property line, reviewed the narrator's security footage, and quickly determined the claim was baseless. The trellis had clearly collapsed under its own weight. But Karen wasn't deterred. If she couldn't win through the HOA or city inspectors, she would try to win in court. Within weeks, Karen's threat became real. A lawsuit was filed, thin on facts, thick on accusations. The narrator was named personally, accused of harassment, defamation, and property damage. The absurdity was staggering, but it still required a formal response. The narrator hired an attorney, one who specialized in property disputes and nuisance cases, and together they prepared to dismantle Karen's claims piece by piece. The first court hearing drew attention far beyond the neighborhood. Residents whispered about it on sidewalks and in coffee shops. Some even showed up at the courthouse steps, curious to see the feud that had become local legend. Inside, Karen arrived dressed as though attending a gala, flanked by her lawyer, radiating smug confidence. The narrator, calm and collected, brought a single flash drive containing hours of video proof and a binder thicker than a phone book. When the judge reviewed the evidence, the case unraveled almost instantly. Footage clearly showed Karen trespassing, vandalizing, and harassing. Complaints she had filed were proven false. Her lawsuit didn't just fail, it collapsed spectacularly. The judge dismissed it outright and warned Karen that any further harassment could result in penalties against her, including paying the narrator's legal fees. The victory was decisive, but it came with consequences. Karen left the courthouse pale and shaking, humiliated in front of neighbors who had gathered to watch. Her campaign of intimidation had backfired completely, but no one knew how she would react to defeat. Would she finally back down, or would her bitterness drive her to something even more reckless? In the days that followed, the street was eerily quiet. No more angry emails, no late-night prowling, no contractors hammering in her yard. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the feud was finally over. The narrator maintained the fence, polishing the cedar boards until they gleamed in the sunlight, standing tall as a monument to resilience. But deep down, there was an unease that wouldn't go away. Karen's silence didn't feel like surrender, felt like waiting. And late one evening, just as the narrator stepped outside to lock up, they noticed something chilling. A fresh set of footprints in the soft soil along the fence line, leading away into the darkness. The battle wasn't over. Karen was planning something new, something she hadn't tried before. And this time, she wouldn't just be fighting in emails or courtrooms. By the time the last nail was hammered into the fence's gleaming new crown, the entire neighborhood seemed to have migrated to their windows, watching in disbelief. What began as a petty complaint had evolved into a suburban landmark, a towering monument to stubbornness. The fence now stood like an impenetrable wall, casting an afternoon shadow so long that it swallowed half the yard behind it. Word spread beyond the block, and curious passers-by drove slowly down the street just to glimpse the infamous fence feud in person. Karen, of course, was livid. The sight of the extra 3 feet, bold, unapologetic, and perfectly legal, was a personal insult she could not ignore. She called the city again, hoping some loophole had been overlooked, but the inspectors arrived, clipboards in hand, and once again confirmed what she feared. Nothing was wrong with the structure. The measurements met code, the property line was intact, and every permit box had been checked. Her outrage boiled over, spilling into loud, performative monologues delivered in her driveway for anyone willing to listen, though fewer neighbors were willing by the day. For the homeowner who built the fence, life became strangely peaceful. The towering boards blocked Karen's constant surveillance, muffling her angry outbursts to little more than distant echoes. What once felt like a siege, endless letters, petty complaints, and passive-aggressive stares, now felt like an island of calm. The yard became a sanctuary again. Barbecues returned, evenings were enjoyed without interruption, and the family dog no longer barked at every flicker of movement on the other side. But Karen was not finished. If she couldn't win with city codes, she would try to win through sheer persistence. She escalated to the HOA, bombarding them with claims that the fence was unsightly, disruptive, and devalued property values. Meeting after meeting was held, but the outcome was always the same. No rule had been broken. Each loss only fueled her bitterness, and soon she began patrolling the neighborhood, snapping photos of other people's minor infractions. Trash cans left out too long, holiday decorations lingering past the season, hoping to rally allies to her cause. Instead, her crusade backfired. Neighbors who once tolerated her began avoiding her. People who had been silent during her earlier disputes now spoke up, sharing stories of her past meddling. One family recalled how she complained about their children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Another revealed she had tried to dictate the color of their mailbox. The fence battle had turned into something bigger, a referendum on Karen herself. The fence, meanwhile, became almost legendary. Someone posted photos of it online with a snarky caption, and within days it spread across social media. Memes appeared, comparing the wooden barrier to castle walls or prison yards, depending on who you asked. Some people drove in from other neighborhoods just to take pictures, laughing as they speculated about the drama brewing behind it. What Karen saw as an outrage, the rest of the world saw as a hilarious monument to pettiness, and the internet always rewarded a good feud. Eventually, the HOA grew tired of her relentless complaints. After one particularly heated meeting where Karen accused them of corruption and favoritism, the board formally censured her behavior, issuing a letter that stunned her into silence. With her allies dwindling and her influence gone, she had no choice but to retreat. The homeowner, on the other hand, carried on quietly, tending to their now private backyard with a satisfied smile. Months later, when the seasons changed and leaves began to fall, the fence remained, weathered but sturdy, still towering above the property line. It had become less of a battle cry and more of a landmark, something people spoke about with a mix of amusement and admiration. The fight was over, but the story lingered like folklore whispered over backyard fences all across the block. In the end, no one forgot how a single complaint had escalated into a legendary standoff. It wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about principle, resilience, and the unshakable will to defend one's home from unnecessary meddling. The fence stood not only as a barrier but as a symbol. Sometimes the best way to deal with unreasonable demands isn't to back down. It's to stand taller, literally. And so, the battle ended not with a legal summons or a forced compromise, but with silence. A silence that stretched across the block, as tall and as solid as the fence itself. 2.